It's a fascinating thing, this recording button. It does look like there is a broad technological advance towards viewing everything everywhere at all times, so that some people have some finger of control on it. And then there's a certain amount of resistance to that, but it's not exactly clear what to do in response. I don't know if any of you guys caught the Joe Rogan conversation that was just released yesterday with Daniel Schmachtenberger and Tristan Harris. Yeah, I mean, I listened to it. I had some time, but also it's one of those ones where it seems like somewhat of a relevant social event, given how large Joe Rogan's podcast is. So it's kind of curious to see what Schmachtenberger and Harris sort of take onto that platform and what they have to express. But there seemed to be basically I wouldn't say an impasse, but the uncanny valley, or the fog before us, seems to be towards a third way that isn't either top-down sensocratic control a la the CCP, and then on the other side, maybe attempts to mimic that and do it worse and kind of shoehorn whatever governments and social orders are in the West into following some mold of that, but not quite managing to do it in the same way. And then you have the sort of big tech doing its own version, perhaps entangled somehow with government, and people are sort of not really sure. But where is privacy in that world? Where is God? Where is how do we navigate the sovereignty of choice? I might say, if I was being a little bit more poetic, the dignity of spirit or soul, and it's sort of its nature to follow its own way. How can that coexist in an environment where there is exponential technology, exponential power, and catastrophe weapons, to use a term that Daniel Schmachtenberger uses? So we have, in this sense, so much power, and there is a dearth of wisdom. That seems to be one of these broad narratives that's now being spoken about more consciously among many, many more millions. And how that actually manages to filter or embody itself in genuine kinds of collaborative response to real patterns is a totally different question. But they were some of the dominant themes anyway of that particular conversation. And they're not a million miles away from what seems to me some of the most prescient framing, but of a conversation we might have together. But anyway, so we've spoken together before, accepting that Anderson and Evan are meeting together for the first time. And it strikes me I haven't been the best host since kind of just launching right into things. I don't know if you guys even know anything about each other at all. Is there some sort of I generally like to walk off the plank in terms of stepping out into that associative space where I try to introduce people. So I'm happy to give that a crack if you like. Evan, Anderson.
I am kind of curious.
I know, it's a very curious.
Yeah, I'd like to give you some rope. Let's see what happens.
Yeah. Well, I think I could probably introduce you to better than I could even introduce Tyler, and I've spoken to Tyler many, many times. So I don't know what that means. Or even introduce myself. That's probably the hardest thing of all. Evan, I'm not sure if you know this. Anderson, what's your title at the University of Toronto?
Assistant professor teaching stream.
There you go. So I don't relate to Anderson basically at all like that. I relate to him as a bloody interesting dude, and that basically is how I relate to everyone here. We've had conversations.
I wish that was my title at the university, frankly. Anyway, yeah.
I think last time I introduced you as a wizard. This time I've gone for bloody interesting dude. That's basically the same thing.
Either of those are good. If I could get bloody interesting wizard, teaching stream, I would be happy. But anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And God, we've spoken about a number of things. I think most of our conversations have tended toward understanding or exploring the space around can a Jungian frame on something like evolution and the development of society have some interesting things to add into the zeitgeist conversation about who we are and what we're doing and how to relate to change. Just recently, Anderson, Tyler, and I had a conversation about NFTs and resourcing the transition in relation a little bit to the metaverse and bridges of wisdom or pathways of development that people might access in such spaces so as to participate perhaps more fully in their own becoming, something like this, in a way that's not disconnected from real patterns in the world. Maybe that's a conversation we could open up. As far as introducing Evan, by his own admission to me, has probably smoked the most 5-MeO DMT in the world. And I was wondering which of like the one sentence taglines I could use to just give like biggest impact for a sentence. Evan, I don't know if you'd use any others.
Well, I mean, a life in general is pretty impossible to summarize in any amount of words, and the degree to which a life path diverges from the sort of standard of society makes that even harder with a shorter number of words. But I guess you could say that my life has been oriented around exploring what it means to be a mind, and what it means to be a mind which is situated in some sort of phenomenal world. And that could apply to almost anyone, but that's been a pretty explicit focus of my life for as long as I can remember. So that's sort of the main thing about me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautifully said. And Tyler has become a close friend of mine, though we haven't met in person. I hope that changes before too long. What else to say? Someone else who I value interaction with and their perspective on the world immensely, and in a way that grooves very much in the same flow as I would say about each of you here. So it really is a pleasure. As for introducing myself, I'm struck, Evan, by how much the general and the specific just seem to be playing games with each other in this way. It seems as though part of maybe the conversation we could have here today, and certainly the path that I'm walking both unconsciously and consciously, is one of understanding who I is and what I is doing, and seeking to do that in a way that is more helpful than not. And that could be put in many other ways. But I suppose there's a certain sense in which if I look at things closely, or maybe from a very great distance, all of a sudden what I'm peering at takes on a degree of complexity, or it might differ from the norm of perception in such a way that makes, well, again, the general and the specific play a certain sort of dance with each other. We can look at some of the most quote unquote ordinary things in life, and how remarkable they are is truly stunning. And so to relate to that preciousness and unicity of experience and its precariousness is something that seems deeply important. And so it's partly with that in mind that I, well, there's so many things worth talking about. Something about the distinction between the esoteric and the exoteric comes to mind just a little bit there, and how we might relate to that dynamic in a way that is interesting. The word faithful came to mind. It seems like we are in the midst of stepping into the kind of global calamity, or a certain kind of chaotic swirl of want to say something like death, which I think is going to necessitate, and does necessitate, a more conscious response from more people with respect to how they relate to their own lives and their own death and their own treatment of others. And so it's perhaps from that angle as well that some of the more mystical ways, perhaps more esoteric ways of relating to the world seem important, not so much to demystify, depending on what we mean by that, but to make somehow more approachable to those who are desiring to approach them, and to do so with others. And well, I had no plan of saying any of that, and I'm sensing I should probably put a pin in myself and just stop it all. Just nice to be here with you, really. I might just ask a question of each of you, and that will be the only structure I would put forward, and then it's really just to go and see where we come to. I might begin with Tyler, just to share maybe what some of your, if you have any intentions coming into this conversation, if they're, because I know we've had a number of conversations. Obviously, we spoke with Anderson the other week. We've had many conversations with Evan, and there is a certain more practical sense of topics for conversation and patterns of action, even real patterns we might be wanting to understand together, which can be of benefit not only to us here and our understanding, but also for those listening, and also for various collaborations we may be a part of. And so it's in service to the coalition of, I think, many streams of inquiry and earnest interest to ultimately collaborate toward the good is why I'm interested in doing any of this at all. So I seem to have launched myself off into space. Perhaps you can help bring a little bit more coherence to what's going on here.
And if I fail, what happens?
Then it's over to Anderson and then Evan. And if we all fail, well, we'll
Beautiful.
have done half the podcast by then. And so we won't have to worry too much more about what comes next.
Exactly. Each of us are each other's parachute, perhaps. There's something that just before we began recording that Anderson said. It had to do with the understanding a changing context for something like the sacred. And the end was, except for all the ethical problems. And I think we could probably append that to almost everything that we're interacting with now. Because whatever it is that's drawing people into conversation, what has specifically drawn me into these realms has to do with the obviousness of institutional failure, of failure within my own life, of being able to meet the continually changing requirements of what it is to be in Evan's particular interest, a conscious, aware mind, a human being. And what does it mean to be that? And I'm aware continuously that there is a spectrum of something like the profane to the mundane to the sacred. And anything that seems to generate prolonged interest and the ability to change while holding on to something, which is what keeps you anchored to sets of patterns and ideas and ways of being, seems to belong into the sacred. And so right now, I find myself in a conversation with people whom I respect for different reasons. And it has not necessarily a causal factor where I have looked at things that you've done and said, oh, well, that is now worthy of respect or a title that one holds. But it has more to do with my desire to bring that with me. That each opportunity we have to speak with each other has the chance for each of us to define what that is like and what comes of it. So I'm very interested in how it is that we maintain a sense of the sacred in conversation with each other and without abusing it, right? Without allowing it to overly influence our set of sensibilities, because it seems that it seems quite powerful to be affected by the sacred. And all right, so then how do you tie that to the pragmatic, right? That's one of the things that I've noticed is to the extent that institutional failure is occurring and individual failure and kind of holographically distributed, this has to do with a decoherence, a de-unifying process of all the parts of the human, both the abstract and the concrete. And so you could look at something like NFTs or cryptocurrencies or decentralizing as a wild enthusiasm that has separated itself and now manifests as its own special interest in the world, you know, as a kind of a purely expressed zeitgeist or egregore, or however you want to term it, which is just this, you know, attending to the phenomenon altogether, and then having a fixed point in the external world that people can gather towards. So with that existing, how can you interrelate it with the other also holographically expressed aspects of right relationship or the organs of culture, and then bring all of those things into coherent conversation? So for instance, my child is now knocking at the door of this room, and he has some interest that I have to now discover and reject or intertwine. And what is that same thing doing in the whole conversational space? Oh, forgive me.
It's interesting thinking about sort of being here in a sense, and the relationship to the sacred. There's a thing that I reflect on quite often in general, and it comes up very frequently when I'm in these sorts of conversations that have become kind of increasingly frequent for me in the last, couple or few years, which is I'm struck very often by, in a sense, the profound weirdness of the situation in which I find myself. So I find very often there is a funny disjoint in some sense between I find my conscious actions and where I end up, which is to say that I often can't quite trace what the conscious line was that I took to get into a situation, except that it is reflective in some way of what I wanted. And of course, it's easy to get supernatural about that, and I try to hold that, lightly at any rate. But the reason that I bring this up is that I think that, when we talk about sort of the sacred and we talk about the profane, we're really talking about, sort of ends of the space that is the numinous. And I think that there is sort of an unappreciated third point in that space, which is the weird. And the weird, to me, the general weirding of things actually strikes me as being one of the sort of dominant forces in what's going on, sort of socially and at large, right? Things are getting profoundly weird. And I mean, there are a bunch of sort of like termination shock barriers that the culture seems to pass through. Like every now and then you get a sense of how strange things are when you realize that, like, I don't know, Snoop Dogg and Martha Stewart are doing a cooking show together or something. And right. And this expresses itself sort of generally within the consciousness as people going like, I think maybe we're in a simulation or something of this kind. Right. So there's like this social level of the weirdingness, what McKenna, I guess, would have referred to as like increased novelty, et cetera, et cetera. But I find that it's actually quite useful just on the individual level, like a recognition of the weird. So anytime I step back and I think to myself, like, okay, so this is what's happening right now. Like, this is where I am. And often there's a funny double space. It is simultaneously like aligned with things that I'm interested in, things that I want, but at the same time is discontinuous or something. I find that I have this experience a great deal in these conversations. And what this often points to, when I'm contemplating it, is the idea that although there is in fact a sort of a swirling gyre of chaos at the sort of visible level, that it seems as though there are sort of organizing structures underneath that are much more difficult to pick up. And those things very often, it seems to me, are operating socially. And I suspect operating socially in a way that really consciously we're not fully picking up on. But you get this idea that there's like a spontaneous concrescence of, community ties and stuff happening. And I think lots of people have mentioned this, right? That as the ability, for us to sort of network together in this way has increased, it seems as though there are structures sort of precipitating out at a level that we're not aware of. And obviously there are lots of powers that would love to strap a harness onto that. Not least the same powers that have decided that they would like to own the metaverse, apparently. My sneaking suspicion is that they will fail miserably at doing so, because large corporations and totalitarian governments are piss poor magicians in my experience. But this idea that there is something somehow sort of like spontaneously organizing itself in this way is something that's very often foremost in my thoughts when I come on these things. I mean, you never know where they're going to go, for one thing, and then there is a profound weirding to that. But also, when you step back from it, it does seem as though there's in some way, inexplicably, like an underlying structure. And it's hard for me to express this in any way, as Evan pointed out. It sometimes pisses me off that words are the only thing that I have in my expressive arsenal. Like, this is not a good medium for me to produce an oil painting in. Yeah.
Yeah, I like weirding. Are you familiar with the Dune novel, or Herbert Frank?
Oh yes, very much.
The weirding way, yeah. So there's something interesting there for sure. Yeah, because it has something, that double space, or that recognition of being outside oneself, or in a suddenly different landscape. It certainly instigates different processes within us in order to meet that thing, right? So when you recognize an anomaly, you then have to do some characterization process, right? And you have to determine if it's harmful or if it's positive. So you start to establish some valence for it, right? And then this is your relevance realization process, where you're starting to try to connect it with patterns that in the past, and understand and situate yourself within it. Yeah. And so in that landscape of utter chaos, what is it that guides you? Right? Because in the landscape where you have people increasingly attempting to control it from the top down, attempting to establish one particular signal as the predominant manner in which how one solves the problem, the partial antithesis to that is that double space. It's the weirding way. It's that recognition of it. Okay, well, maybe it's more that I shy away from these dominant themes that someone from the top or from some charismatic voice is saying it for sure it has to be, and continue to maintain a tendency to that double space, right? Because that is in fact the landscape of novelty, where if there is going to be some recognition of a continual trend that establishes itself as an organ of culture, then it will be from outside of that. Although there's still difficulty in that, because as many people are becoming increasingly convinced, those pre-established signals may be the already developed organ. Now, I think you can just assume that is the case, and that what you have is simultaneously developing cultural bodies, and that some will only persist so far. So the failure of the metaverse controlled by Facebook is foretold, right? What is the thing that will surpass it, or survive it, or be birthed from it? And that's another part of what it is to discuss the sacred, I think. Certainly anything associated with bringing new life into this world should be.
Yeah. I'm wondering, Evan, if it would be worthwhile, and I notice I'm curious to hear you expand on this, but it's again it's a challenge here for me to speak this, because I know there's so much brilliant depth to your perspective and what you have to offer. But let's say one of your endeavors is somewhat housed under the term the bridge. So what does the bridge mean philosophically, and how does that perhaps relate to what's beginning to presence here? Is it a relevant link to make?
It certainly can be. So I didn't name the project myself. That was Peter Limburg's wonderful coinage, which I was happy to adopt at his suggestion when I did the first session over at the Stoa. But it is a pretty apt title for one of my projects. And so the things being bridged are roughly the sort of scientific, rational perspective and the more esoteric, mystical perspective. Now, a bridge does not mean a unification, right? Things being bridged still have their distinct nature. So that's important to mention. But I kind of think of this in terms of a pretty large scale sweep of history. You know, you could look at the main intellectual endeavor of the past several hundred years being an effort collectively to sort of pin down the, invariant and regular patterns which seem to unfold in intersubjective experience. Right now, we can go ahead and take the hypothesis that there's such a thing as objective reality, which seems like a decent hypothesis to take, but all we can really show is that we have some sort of intersubjective experience, and that there exists some sort of regularities in the transition from moment to moment in that experience. And so we've come up with a language of specifically formal languages, a set of formal languages and their interrelationships that we might call math, that we use to describe these regularities. And in doing so, we've been really quite tightly focused on this as at least as an intellectual class in society for the past several hundred years. And this has resulted in compared to the historical norm, a sort of defocusing, a de-emphasis on the nature of what it is to be a conscious mind, the nature of subjectivity, as opposed to intersubjectivity or this hypothetical objectivity, right? So the bridge is basically an attempt to look at the traditions that we've received from the past. And, my own experience in this is pretty broad and varied. I've focused in a lot on things like Vajrayana Buddhism, things like the Fourth Way, Gurdjieff work, things like yoga. I grew up with an Iyengar yogi as a mother, so that is a pretty big influence on me as well. And of course, the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers. Special place in my heart for Parmenides in particular. And so I'm looking at the sort of commonalities between these traditions, the same way that we started out with sciences of biology and chemistry and physics, and the list goes on, and we continue to be able to unify these. We continue to be able to reduce the total number of moving parts, the total number of epicycles. We continue to get closer to a unified view of the sort of transition functions that explain the transitions from moment to moment in intersubjective or objective reality. And there exist 1,000 plus 4, 5,000, 6,000, 10,000 year old lineages, which were according to me at least a similarly good faith and disciplined effort by extremely capable people to come together and find the core and explain to each other what was going on with subjective reality and being a mind. And so for me, I find both of these projects extremely fascinating, and I find that what people refer to as the meta crisis, or John Vervaeke refers to as the meaning crisis, all of these interlocking issues that people in our society are experiencing, as well as society as a whole, insofar as you can say society has an experience, seems to be experiencing, seems to be not entirely, but I'd say mainly a sort of downstream consequence of this hyper focus on discovering the nature of the sort of shared reality of physical objects and physical forces that most of our intellectual effort has gone to over the past few hundred years. And so we've sort of left by the wayside the sort of, you could call them the spiritual sciences, or, you know, whatever you want to call that whole ball of wax. But this is not really a set of fields that promising, intelligent, capable young people are encouraged to go into. You know, growing up as a fairly high achieving young student, everybody would have looked askance at someone if they said, "Oh, I want to go be a monk. I want to go be a priest. I want to go be a rabbi." Like this, you basically would have been laughed out of campus, right? No, you're supposed to want to be a physicist or a doctor, a researcher, a biologist, you know, a computer scientist, right? Well, this is the sort of divide that the bridge is well attempting to bridge, right? Is the sense that the sense that these are two fully separate magisteria. I think that it's a little bit more interesting and complex than that. And secondly, the idea that we should privilege the sort of exact and objective sciences as the highest form of intellectual inquiry. I think this is basically wrong, and that, you know, sort of equal consideration should be given to those who are pursuing, you know, an honest inquiry of what it means to be a mind and how consciousness operates, and, you know, from the subjective perspective, from the perspective of being the sort of entity which has experiences, not just the sort of entity which can measure phenomena that are objectively measurable. So this is the sort of thrust of my, you know, my project. And I keep coming back to some of the roots of the Western tradition, actually, as an interesting way of unifying this. And so I mentioned my particular love for Parmenides. He's an incredibly fascinating figure because he is credited as the father of logic and Western rationality. And yet all we have left of his actual writings are fragments of an incantatory poem where he is taken to the underworld by the goddess of death herself and given a sort of initiation. The word aporia comes up in this poem quite a lot. Aporia, without aporia, passage or path, right? Socrates would later use this word. And so this sense of being in the midst of a deeply confusing situation where the only thing you know is how lost you are, right? Like the recognition of aporia as the first step to being able to do anything. Well, that seems to be basically where we're at the societal and collective level. And so, you know, I find it especially fascinating that, you know, Parmenides was not just or even primarily a philosopher. The tradition he was a part of was called the Yacht tradition, which means priest healer, essentially. And they practiced something called incubation, where you would go into a cave or other extremely dark space and lie motionless for hours or days or even weeks until you receive visions. Now, we know from more modern studies from the scientific side, the Taoists do this sort of thing too. They call it a darkroom retreat. And this results in, after a certain number of days, enhanced production of DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, and monoamine oxidase inhibitor alkaloids within the brain itself. And so leads to essentially an endogenous ayahuasca experience. So the very root of the Western tradition of logic and rationality was a guy who went and hung out in caves until he started tripping. And this is where he got his info, basically. So, you know, we're sort of back to square one as a society. We're in a place of pathlessness, a place of utter confusion. And Parmenides emphasizes the importance of this particular capacity called metis, right? Aristotle would go on to refer to something similar with the word phronesis. There was a bit of a linguistic shift there, but I like the word metis better because of its connection with the Titaness of wisdom, Zeus's first wife. And so that's the sort of orientation of my project right now is investigating metis per se, and how do we embody metis? How do we communicate and transmit the essence of metis to others who might be interested in this? And so this is sort of my fundamental orientation at this point.
So there were a bunch of things that jumped out to me there, but so first off, it's always interesting to see where people land on the Parmenides Heraclitus cage match. So I want to talk about that at greater length at some point. Also, of course, shades of Pythagoras and the Thunderstone rite. right? And the frankly massively underappreciated sort of shamanic roots of most of the philosophic tradition in the West, all of which got sort of scattered to the winds under the onslaught of analytic technique when it should have maybe been integrated. Yeah, so there were a few things that jumped out there. I mean, one thing that really spoke to me, it's interesting, you know, when you talk about sort of the attempting to overcome the idea that these two domains are like non-overlapping magisteria, right? And attempting to get back to some earlier vision. You know, there are, of course, real, you know, scientific and philosophical problems that have been raised, right? Such that we kind of can't just go back. We sort of have to go forward and through. However, one of the things that's really struck me, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years, like in the university and campus culture particularly, is the extent to which this stuff has really resurged in the interest set. So it's very often not the case, actually. I find that students are necessarily attracted into, like, you know, the hard sciences per se. Very often, actually, I see, and this in part might be because of what I teach, but I see lots and lots of students being attracted into this. So a thing that I found myself saying quite a bit, and often in conferences and stuff, is like, between psychedelics, role-playing games, you know, sort of mysticism, Jungianism, etc. I find myself in this jarring space where I'm on the winning side of a cultural argument, which I'm not used to. And there has been this broad sweep, right? I mean, some of this is like grounded out in, you know, a little bit of McMindfulness, which hopefully is a Trojan horse for something a little bit deeper, frankly. But the point is that there is, in fact, a substantial interest, it seems to me now, academically, in exploring so many of these subjects, right? Consciousness is a subject that's, you know, really on the table. Sophiology, the study of wisdom, is something that's really actually on the table. And of course, lots and lots of students being interested in sort of, you know, the psychedelic, and very often not just in its sort of, you know, hallucinatory aspect, you know, but really in that like mind revealing, mind manifesting, you know, and as a way of exploring what mind is. So it's interesting. The other thing that occurs to me is, given that your project is a bridge, that does license you to refer to yourself as pontifex, which I encourage you to take full advantage of if you can. Any advantage to refer to yourself as pontifex in the realm of bridge building, you should always seize, in my opinion. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that. And I do take your meaning there. I think it's fascinating because this is a marked shift in culture. So, you know, when I was 19 years old, I dropped out of college because I tried majoring in philosophy and classics. I had a bit of a math major going, which was all right. And then the religion department. And unfortunately, at that time, at a pretty high quality state school in the United States, it was simply not the case that the level of interdisciplinary study that I was interested in was available to undergraduates. And so, you know, I'm happy to see from the outside and hear about from people who are on the inside of the academy that these changes are happening, that I also appear to be on the rising tide side of a particular cultural movement. This is in some sense gratifying, although you know, I am quite wary of the institutional incentives at play in academia and the particular organizational styles. We could look at trends of the ratio of administration employees to teaching faculty. We could look at research budget allocations. We could look at a lot of other sort of indicators. And so, you know, I'm currently occupying a position where I am optimistic that the academy is not on its deathbed, but if I were forced to place a bet on it, I would probably bet that the academy writ large loses its sense of being a center of cultural relevance within the next 100 years pretty irrecoverably.
Oh, I would be shocked if it took that long. I mean, the university, you know, whatever, it's a 1,000-year-old institution, but it hasn't been what it now is really since the GI Bill. You know, that's more or less what brings it in. And the idea that there is some, you know, automatic ladder of socioeconomic increase that comes about with, it's diluted the whole thing and saddled everybody with debt that, hopefully the university doesn't watch this, but the whole thing's a shit show and a dinosaur. And the sooner that it, dies back down to about 10% of its scale and refines its spiritual values, the better. However,
exactly, and what you just said to the spiritual values part, because that transition you're speaking of, I mean, the university had its origin as a training ground for spiritual practitioners, and that was lost at some point along the way. And I would love to see an organization that looked something like in between, say, a Tibetan monastery and a Western university. So we have the sciences and sociology and all this kind of thing, but we also have that grounding in the sacred, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird because the framing we just came at this with puts me as an insider at the university, which I'm really not used to thinking of myself as. I'm a high school dropout who avoided higher education for years and years. And when asked, well, if you were going to go to school, what would you do? The only answer I could ever come up with was neurotheology, which was not a thing. And so, and frankly, I was lucky insofar as when I decided to go through, with an eye towards some degree of professional accreditation, the 2 words, John Vervaeke is the answer. And having I had known John from way back, but having sort of stumbled into that and gotten into cognitive science. And cognitive science at the University of Toronto, frankly, is not the same thing as cognitive science at other universities. There is something profoundly broader and stranger happening at U of T. So, I was lucky, basically. Between that and the fact that they had a Jungian minor and a Buddhist psychology and mental health program, I was in interdisciplinary heaven. And have now found myself within that system, frankly, to my enormous surprise. And maybe the shaming of my 17-year-old self, who I suspect would like to smack me upside the head. But anyway, be that as it may, yeah, the university as a sort of a tandem social organization alongside the monastic system was, a system we had going for a long time. They were sort of both repositories of learning and, held over to a great extent through, the Dark Ages, such as they were. And then, of course, the Reformation rolls in and all of a sudden everybody realizes that you can sack the monasteries and take their gold, and half of that stuff falls off the map. University preserves what it can, but it doesn't really keep many of those traditions and sort of, techniques and stuff. It would be nice to see an evolution of that system towards, as I sometimes put it, a kind of Castalian ideal, right? So, a glass bead game, right? Towards a kind of Castalian ideal where, we divorced the pursuit of knowledge from primary economic incentives, but in a way that still rendered sort of, meaningful interplay and didn't just let it spiral off into, abstraction and nonsense. Not that abstraction is necessarily nonsense, it certainly isn't, but, I would love to see a system. I have sort of assumed that is going to occur long after I'm dead. But I would be happy to see at least, some of the rails get laid out before I go. I mean, a dark age would go a long way in that direction, and we seem to be headed there. So that's, positive. Anyway.
Okay. So laying some rails there. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Laying the way. A little bit. So all right, I'm going to see if I can do a bit of a transition to presencing the wonderful world of Bored Ape Yacht Club, which I did raise to Anderson and Tyler in our last conversation. And Evan, I see you Googling away there, Bored Ape. Yep, that's definitely the right thing to do. You'll essentially get the full memetic hit of what I mean just by seeing an image of one of the bored apes. So I encourage those listening, if you aren't aware of this, just to whip out your phone or give it a quick Google. So for those of you not doing that, the Bored Ape Yacht Club is effectively a series of 10,000 NFTs, basically JPEGs with receipts, as I've heard them described, so that there's only one unique version of each that exists on the blockchain, in this case, Ethereum, and on OpenSea as the exchange. And they were to be understanding created by a group of artists, but they're essentially something like a modular set of images. Some apes look very similar, others look a little bit different, but they roughly all have the same shape. Some are more rare than others. And in a very short space of time, they went from being worth, or at least sold initially for just a few $100s, to, in some cases, the more rare ones, several million, just a few weeks to a few months later. And some that are close to that price, and people refuse to sell them because they supposedly have other kinds of value. Now, they very much do have a certain kind of value. At least they can get you into the club. They can get you into a party. They can network you with a whole bunch of other people who have decided that it's worthwhile to have one of these pictures. And this is just the beginning of, a lot to come. And there are many more series of NFTs, many of which, of course, don't have any value. And so there's something of an aggregation of attention and social interest. And I'm going to use community in quotation marks here, because there is a common unity, i.e. we're going to decide that these particular images are valuable, and that the club and the place to be cool, and maybe the place to play a little Ponzi game in the meantime while we're being cool with each other is, and that's that. Maybe there's a bit of money laundering, whatever. We get to rub shoulders with celebrities. There's some weird social stuff happening. Okay. But community in brackets, because the whys, or the roots of this particular community don't appear to me, at least, to stretch well deep into the wellspring of wisdom in terms of intentionality toward some sort of right participation in the ecosystem, or any sense that it's all basically all in the name. These and it's self-effacing in this way. These are essentially bored crypto millionaire types who are wealthy enough to have yachts, but otherwise there's a dearth of meaning in their lives. In that sense, they're bored apes. And it seems to be a very powerful meme from that perspective, because it speaks to this moment in many ways that we're talking about, in the context now in presencing NFTs and Web3 as a context of an overflow of resources caused by something like the technological toppling of, or at least the perturbation of the old world. There's a lot spilling over, and there's new possibilities as a result. So in the context of what we seem to be presencing here, which is an interest in something like gathering together in some with some interesting mindset toward what my friend Lawrence Curry Clark mentioned to me in conversation. I think I mentioned it to you guys as well, as a pre-stitution. Anderson, not convinced we'll see it before having another dark age, but it would be nice to see some railroads laid down. Something like this. The question is it possible to orient or to interact with the immense overflow of potential resources that seemingly want to cluster around various sorts of memes to resource a distributed, say, collective network, series of networks of people in some form of creative collaboration to what? I mean, I'm now seeking to, sum up what we might say about the somewhere in between a monastery and a university. That's just part of it. I think it looks to me like what's necessary would also ask of us something that's perhaps even more general in that to the extent there is a breakdown of systems in society, then something even more resilient when it comes to powerful action in the world might be required, i.e., eventually places to live that are not, burying their heads in the sand about even potential for things like men with guns and those in positions of power to orient them, to control them. Basically, what I'm pointing to is that there seems to be this. It seems to be important to take so much into account. Do you know what I mean? And when I look, for instance, at the kinds of people who might cluster around memetic opportunity, maybe in the case of NFTs, cryptocurrency, or what have you, who have as primary motivation something like some combination of power, reputation, security, from a basis of coming from a deep basis of insecurity and, in some sense, ungroundedness with respect to trust in the worthwhileness of life or something like this, maybe not feeling in their soul something worth dying for, that there is something quite dangerous about that scramble. But nevertheless, it is a scramble that's wanting to take powerful steps in the world, and one that's wanting to maximize through its own network of collaboration its agency, but might not be doing so from a basis that it, in fact, has engaged in something like, whether we want to say some sort of deeply connective experience, a deeply connective commitment to, in my language, I want to say something like loving transformation, but and I also seem to like terms like life affirming, but I appreciate there's lots that life must affirm in order to affirm itself, right? There's transcendence and intelligence and a whole bunch of things. So that's a lot there at present. But you see what I'm trying to get at? Maybe I'll stop there. It looks like Anderson, you're nodding.
Yeah. So since we got together the first time and discussed NFTs, I was introduced to the Bored Ape Yacht Club and a bunch of the things around it. I've done, quite a lot of sort of reading around it and quite a lot of, sort of slow walking contemplation, trying to get some sense of what's going on there. And simultaneously, obviously, trying to get some sense of, where the application is, like what's the utility of it above and beyond just being sort of a conventionalized trading game, like the games that were sort of conjured out of the ether by amphetamine addicts in San Francisco in the 60s when they spontaneously developed economies of blue stones in the park. So I thought about this, and I decided after a while, and I'm completely open to somebody knocking this interpretation apart. In fact, I sort of hope you do. But I decided after a while that what they are is just trading. They're just trading cards, which reduces them in a way. They're artificially scarce trading cards, which have almost no utility and a very low degree of novelty. But because they have some amount of novelty, and because they're technologically novel, some people are going to hitch onto them. And the artificial scarcity, right? We've put a lot of energy into these sort of artificially scarce new digital currencies. Now, never mind that I have this stinking suspicion that a lot of people invested in this space are going to get their comeuppance when somebody really actually breaks through quantum supremacy, and it turns out that all of their cryptography falls to bits, and none of this stuff is protected at all. And there are, of course, already large heists going on in anticipation of the computing technologies a decade hence, so that they can crack into that stuff. But leaving that aside for a second, as it stands, it's trading cards. That's what it is. And trading cards are subject to the same kinds of crazes, right? You could get a very fair market price in real goods for like a mint condition Mickey Mantle card or something of this kind, right? Or a decent Pokemon card or a really good Magic the Gathering card. Like these things have some real market value. People will pay for them. Now, they don't seem to even have the same degree of like hedonic utility as, say, like a Pog, which at least was part of a game, or a Magic card or a Pokemon card, which at least you could play a game with. Like, you can't play games with these apes. There is no arena in which you can take the apes to make them yacht at each other or something. So, it
that
seems
will
like
be
there's
the metaverse to come.
Oh, yes, I assume so. So, it seems as though these are like the first forays into trying something on for size, right? And, the novelty of the technology alone is spurring it. But I don't see that having, frankly, a lot of utility. You can take every damn JPEG in the world and stick a crypto chain on it and call it valuable, but that doesn't actually make it valuable. And pretty quickly, right, as the rate of authenticity nosedives under mechanical reproduction, that all falls apart. But the real question is, okay, but what can you do with it? Like, what can you do with it that's actually interesting, right? What could you do with it where you could somehow apply that same technology to something that has actual utility and actual value in some meaningful way? Now, some of that's a quibble, right? Because, like, what's actual value? At some level, you could make the argument that if we're talking about something that's sort of life-supporting, the only actual value is value that grounds out in sort of the biological, right? Food. If it doesn't ground out in a food, you've missed the point. And even gold is just a useful ductile abstraction, which allows you to trade around grain, because if you have all the gold and none of the grain, you're screwed. But what could we actually do with this? And so I kind of kicked the can around on a few things. One thing that occurred to me, and I couldn't tell whether this was a good thing or a bad thing, but I thought it would be extremely interesting to be able to apply this kind of technology to like highly individualized utterances as a way of finalizing attribution and ownership over intellectual ideas. This is something that we have, moved towards in our culture, right? Citation, attribution, et cetera. And in academia, it's the currency of the realm, right? Getting people to like cite your papers it's what it's all about. It's not about the paychecks. It's about people citing your ideas. That is the big trade, right? But of course, if you could nail that down to sort of individual ideas and have those be in some sense like individualized and attributable and non-fungible and tradable and whatever. But as soon as I had that thought, I thought, wait, maybe that's actually really, really bad. Like maybe we would be better off sliding back in the direction of the culture in which every good book was just attributed to some previous sage or labeled anonymous, and we had sort of an open exchange. But anyway, this is what I was thinking about, trading cards. And what I'm really interested in is either somebody knocking that apart, and I encourage people to do so, or some idea you have about like the alternate deployment of this technology in a way that actually preserves like utility, really taps into some kind of actual value.
So
I was go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
So one obvious area of utility that some people are working on, I'm thinking particularly of the Materium project that Vinay is working with, is using the idea of NFTs to provide traceability for physical assets, right? Mm-hmm. So, they're starting out with like art objects, gold bullion, real estate, things where a chain of custody might be in dispute, might be really mattering. But what I'm personally excited about is, I personally do eat meat, and I also personally care about where my food comes from, right? And I've seen any number of news stories recently involving scandals where some place was selling supposedly pasture-raised, grass-fed beef that had, the cows had a good life. And it turns out, no, this was just from some industrial slaughterhouse. They were just pocketing the difference, right? Well, if you had traceability of the cow had an NFT assigned to it. And so it had to get scanned, at each individual place that it and parts of it went to, then you'd have the ability to verify that. Same thing with whether a given piece of seafood actually was sustainably fished or whether it was from some, farm or some, non-sustainable operation, that sort of thing. So, and this does connect, you made me think of this when you spoke of how value is in some sense ultimately grounded biologically in the sense of food. So I'll turn it over to you, Tyler, real quick. But one other thought I had is sort of agreeing with you, Anderson, in that the trading card analogy is pretty strong. And so NFTs are just a new technology for enabling this sort of thing. We've had this sort of thing, artificial scarcity schemes, for as far as I can tell, as long as there's been civilization. And so I look at this from a sort of 30,000-foot view, and I say, well, when you have a society that is going crazy over assets with no link to a fundamental biological value, except perhaps a very tenuous link to, sexual mate selection value or something like this, then you're essentially looking at a society whose currency distribution, whose value distribution is extremely unbalanced and fucked, right? So the fact that we have enough people out there to support a thriving ecosystem in Yacht Club Apes is a kind of damning indictment of our society. And so that's my take on that, and I'll pass it over to you, Tyler.
I love the idea. Oh, sorry. I love the idea of the butcher's blockchain. That's a very good, practical utility. And on the other side, I was just going to say quick that the issue is, of course, the general abstraction of our economic systems, right? This is one extra layer of abstraction of artificial scarcity. That's not fundamentally different than a bunch of zeros floating through computers that have no real bearing. It's not clear to me that Jeff Bezos himself has any understanding of what his wealth is or means or connects to the world in any way whatsoever, right? It's just like more zeros in some sense. And that's the problem, of course, that's hit, a lot of us. Anyway, sorry.
No, I didn't. I was going to take an attempt at knocking it down or take a stab at it, or, whatever particularly violent metaphor we want to use it. But you already began in the very act, because anytime someone uses the word just, I read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance when I was fairly young, and he attacks that word just because they used it to attack him. And I think you immediately unpacked it and you said, well, maybe it's not just, and you started to expound upon what it could be otherwise. And so if we just take that further, first taking a look at the use of the word just in the realm of objectification, because what you're attempting to do there is hold content the same in a different context, right? And that is in fact moving towards, I think, the more spiritual dimension of where the subjective has continuity of contact with ultimate realms, right? And that what we're looking for is an opportunity to assign value in these different landscapes, different contexts. So an NFT is just an NFT, except for when it is used to be a trading card game, or when it is used to assign a location to a block of meat or whatever, right? And that if we do in fact find a value for an ultimate value, what we're trying to do is find its power. We're trying to find its capacity to affect some change in the world. And that this is in fact the root of all of our problems, because as we gain more and more knowledge and more capacity, we have the ability to do more and more harm with ignorance, in fact, as you were just pointing out with Bezos. The accrual of power and capacity at some point goes far beyond your own initial conditions of understanding. And you begin having all these externalities, which are fundamentally harmful to and disruptive to the interlocking web of life and activity on this globe. And so there's a weird paradox here that I'm noticing with regards to these non-overlapping magisteria in the Gouldian sense, but with, some bridge between them, where our objective scientific capacities have increased over time by using reduction to establish tools which give us power to affect change in the world. And yet, when we look at complex webs of life, it is less and less a reduction in epicycles and more an accretion of them, right? So when I actually zoom into any given aspect of life, it seems to just be full of epicycles of organisms interacting on each other as selective pressure mechanisms with regards to resourcing and destruction and or maintenance of particular structures. And that if there's anything that needs to occur right now, it seems to be related to, and this is where John's work, I think, is so important, developing the wisdom, which I see now as the technique associated with the use of each tool that our powerful scientific reductionism has been able to produce. because you can see a hammer, but without knowing how to use that hammer well in any given circumstance, it can be anything, right? The tool can be anything. And that includes very harmful things. So it can be used to murder, or it can be used to build a house. And so I think there isn't really any way to utilize NFTs irrespective of the subjective context, right? That the only people who will be able to utilize NFTs properly, and that this will constitute the distinction between these developing cultural organisms. You'll have the sameness of content, but the different context will be the individuals handling, comprehending the value will be those who have internally the distinctions and capacities and wisdom necessary to utilize them. And so you have to have this educational component, which gives us a chance to expand and explore and build the techniques needed to coincide with this ever increasing exponential capacity with the tools themselves. And if those things don't go hand in hand, we get ultimate destruction. And I think that's probably an inevitability in certain circumstances, but the degree to which that cascades throughout all of these interconnected complex systems of life, that is certainly something we can't prophesy completely about, but we would like to inure ourselves to it somehow. And yeah, so those are some of the thoughts I was thinking as you guys were speaking on that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I maybe I was a little too glib. I was trying to take a stab in that direction, in which the question is for me is almost always like, what can we do with this, right? And so as I was rolling it around in my head, and I was asking myself, like, okay, Bored Ape Yacht Club, what can I do with this? Like, what can I do with it? And of course, it's always possible, sort of, that the like penumbra of effort to do something that is more, there's no reason you couldn't take it and treat it as a sacred object, right? Given that kind of like self-reflective component that Tim was pointing at the outset, right? It's like all in the title. It's like, yes, if you wanted to treat it as an element of the sacred, right? These like minor distinctions between bored yacht apes, right? There probably is a spiritual focus in there. You could treat it like an icon or something in that way, right? And if you really wanted to dig into it, this is the point that I always make. It's not that some things are archetypal and others aren't. It's all archetypal. It's just a matter of seeing the way in which it's archetypal, right? It's a shift in your interpretive mindset, not a function of the content, really. So yeah, I get all that. I guess what I was sort of stabbing towards was like, yeah, you're right. I am using a lot of violent metaphors. Okay, what I was reaching towards with open embrace was this question of like, okay, what they've done with it thus far is interesting. I see potential in it. Its current formulation, I'm like, well, I'm just not that interested in trading cards anymore. But what if I was going to do something with it? I suppose what are the things that we could do? Like, what's the possibility space around it? So that's sort of where I was landing in it around it. And
well, let me just throw this in.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. No.
When last we spoke, the idea that I seem to be centered around is not necessarily the attribution aspect, but the ability to accrue that expressed enthusiasm in the culture for. So I mean, you're right about pointing out the thin slice of novelty attached to it, right? But I think in this realm of everything always being produced as novel, right? Okay, let me just bring in this piece too. Working with Eric Weinstein in this portal group, and trying to well, aside from his motivations, but one of the things he always spoke about was how he termed it the twin nuclei problem. And this has to do with, again, scientific materialism and its reduced capacity to get down to the bottom of things and then enact some really powerful, effective change on it. And so now, with our knowledge of the inside of the cell and with our knowledge of the inside of the nucleus of the atom, we have this twin capacity to destroy absolutely everything. We're under the effects of the pandemic right now, which is potentially associated with that phenomenon. And we've, for many decades now, been under the potential catastrophic collapse of nuclear proliferation. So I would always argue with him that his formulation was incomplete, and I think it was incomplete perhaps by design, but there's a third nuclei, which is the mind of man, which is understanding deeply the subjective and conscious experience. And when we do understand that, we can manage the patterns that we see to affect change in the world in the same way that we could with an intensified tool, right?
Mhm.
And that these psychotechnologies, to use John's term, when understood and applied, give you the opportunity to make something like the Bored Ape Yacht Club, wherein you are exacting these very old mechanisms in the mind of maintaining attention to the rare, right? And just putting it in a new context, and then, people play that game out. But so expressing all of that outwards, how do you take the total enthusiastic space for the novel, right? And then map onto it the wise ways of using it. And I think that what you're looking at there is using the enthusiasm as a pool or a resource, and then the NFT as an attractor to something of value, right? So it's the signal that you're trying to use, or at least you're trying to exact to direct attention to something of value. And that something of value seems to be, for me anyways, is the ability to wisely converse with each other such that we land on some contextually relevant, subjective sense of how to become wise, right? How to simultaneously like co-develop these techniques to use with the tools. And so if we can utilize NFTs to assign attention to the value of that process, so if we can get people to come together in conversations they would not ordinarily happen without all of that enthusiastic space, congealing in attention on that NFT, maybe that's something we can do. Like we can issue a rare event rather than just a rare token, right?
Beautifully said, beautifully articulated. Yeah. I think that's an important piece. I would tie this together, and again, putting this forward for retort, but I would tie this together with potential strategies that would seek to siphon resources from the previous structure. So the language of game A and game B is maybe a bit helpful here, particularly in the context of trading cards, where people might just be doing it back and forth, maybe for, in some sense, playing a game that's become so abstracted from any return of real value to, in a sense, of grain, although of course they could just sell that collectible to buy grain. But my meaning is more something like we could just trade things back and forth because we want reputation and clout, and that's the end of it. Or we could have some scenario in which we could have intent towards patronage interact with the desire of others who are just wanting to trade back and forth, even for their own ends of just making money and clout. An image might be something like, if these are a bunch of bored apes, maybe we can just gently influence those yachts to becoming something like a pontoon archipelago that people can sort of stay the course of the storm, on for a little bit of time. Probably not that helpful as an analogy, really. But the point is something like, are there sort of big ticket moments of resourcing that can be utilized to neutrify efforts that otherwise are very difficult to neutrify? Where Tyler's mentioning the notion of an event, I could envisage mintings of NFTs as results of, or as a artifact, partial kind of outcome of events of interaction, where there was deep care and intention and effort made in service of worthwhile interaction. that itself was valuable to contribute to and belong to, but also to learn in and to gift something then to the commons beyond. That's seeking to be in touch with real pathways of education, as well as democratizing a participation in understanding and connection between people, and in seeking to embed that connection back into local life, or at least into relationships, beginning in a more distributed sense first. And so there's the notion of something of a transitionary strategy that can call on models of patronage to gain further wind to the sails as a result of those who aren't necessarily seeking to invest for what someone might say are the right reasons. They might just think there's reputation involved, and because there's royalties of the trading of the NFTs and what have you. But that still seems to me to be and I'm not saying that's the final piece, but as a certain step forward. There's another piece to mention here, which is in a slightly different direction, and I think just speaks to some of the dilemmas of technology in general and the increased and the acceleration of its development we find ourselves in the context of artificial intelligence, GPT-3, and that capacity to spray noise into the system. I'm somewhat a bit wary of using technology as a means to somehow counter that capacity of technology. I mean, you already mentioned, well, what if the blockchains can be hacked in various ways? But that's another potential direction. How it won't be too long before trusting someone's utterance is going to be a difficult thing. And so communities engaging in some sort of interaction that had some resilience to that noise by virtue of some integration with authenticating technology. There's that throws up a lot of, it's a big thing to throw up. I'm not putting it forward with any conclusivity or something. Yeah.
Well, I just add concretely, I experienced this last night. I was contacted on WhatsApp by an individual claiming to be a real person, but by probing this, I discovered it's probably just some complicated machine learning chatbot. And I could screen share and show you the really interesting conversation, but it's an individual claiming to be a real estate investor from Hong Kong, some kind of honeypot or phishing scheme or something. But I've had probably 6 of those in the past 3 weeks. It's really interesting. They send just a random message, and if you respond, they either do or don't respond, but they fish for information. And who knows what the ultimate game is? Maybe it's just training. I don't know. But it's absolutely already beginning to infect our communication networks. And I mean, if you really visit any of the social media sites and start applying tools, and I would point out that there are many people developing tools for capturing these things, right? So sort of monitoring whether or not there's a falseness in the signal. But it's occurring everywhere. Amazon reviews, Reddit posts. All of these avenues of manipulating information and what we receive are now infected by bots of various complexities and nuance. So we're there. It's going to be in the visual auditory space soon, right? It already has been with.
I was going to say by prototype, right? There are plenty of fairly good platforms that will do analysis. If you've got 15 minutes of speech, it'll kick out a surprisingly credible President Obama and attach that to novel video and deep faking. And who would have thought that the sort of mid 21st century would at least in some part be dominated by like a Turing test arms race But that's about where we're going to find ourselves, I suspect, right? The kind of through the looking glass qualities. And it's one thing for it to replicate text, but it's something completely different if it starts to starts to be able to move into like video audio. At that point, the fragmentation of the information scape, which is already frankly pretty thorough at this point, but it'll be absolutely bonkers. Yeah. So that's interesting. If we could reverse that with, authenticity tagging or something.
Yeah. Well, it would seem to me that that could only ever be part of the solution. It's the degree to which it's almost something like, can we build some resilience into the channels of invitation so that when the event commences, there's not so much chaos that it's impossible to create the dynamics of genuine conversation rather than mob on mob, whatever that becomes, some diatribe. I'm curious, Evan, where you're at in your reflections. You've been listening for some time, and so I'm wondering what's mulling over for you.
Well, I mean, the main thing that's been going on for me is feeling like there's a certain economic element that's not been present in the discussion about NFTs, and so sort of internally griping about that. So in brief, there's a situation that happened already once with the transition to, your sort of fiat currencies and fractional reserve systems, right? Whereby by decoupling the supply of currency from any particular, fixed physical quantity, then what you essentially get is the ability of those who are responsible for regulating the amount of currency produced to enrich themselves through seigniorage and other processes, right? So when you think about it, you look at some of the theories that are becoming popular, especially on the left, say here in America, things like modern monetary theory, right? They're looking at the fact that the real, goal of a currency in some sense ought to be to match all of the things that can be done, that want to be done, with the resources that could be put forward to do those things. And so there's going to be a sort of happy point with that, where you have the right amount of currency in the system in order to, cause all of the life aligned and positive public projects to happen, and that allow people to gain enough private resources to live good private lives as well. And so it seems to me that, regardless of getting into the specifics of MMT as an economic theory, which is way out of scope for this particular podcast, I think that something about this model is essentially on the right track. And so when you look at the issues that we've faced in our economy over the past couple of years, in fact, I think this really drives something home that, we all experienced being locked down mainly in our homes, not able to go out and do things that were meaningful to us, not able to see our friends. I know some people in the world are still in that position primarily. I don't know how you are personally, Tim, now, but some of my other friends in Australia are still feeling very constrained by these things. And so this makes doing projects which create value for you, your friends, your family, much more difficult, and puts you at personal risk if you try to do this. So if we look at what happened over that time period, it turns out that people got richer in pretty direct proportion to how closely connected they were to the central banks of the countries, right? Which, of course, have the ability to issue currency and determine how much of it gets issued, and therefore essentially what the value ends up being, right? So what happens when you flood the market, so to speak, with additional currency? Well, you get inflation like we've been experiencing, and you also tend to get this sort of phenomenon that I see NFTs as an instance of, where these sorts of positional goods without much inherent value for creating or maintaining life begin to shoot up in perceived valuation. And things tend to become more of the aspect of, sort of social status signaling games, as far as the activities that culture is centering on and promoting as having some sort of shared value. I'm reminded a lot of the way that fashion proceeded in the court of Louis XIV, for example, right? Whereby there was no real benefit to changing styles every couple weeks to match what the king was doing, except for your position, your social position. And the sort of people who can, in a very real sense, afford to do that are are not you and I. They are not probably really any of the listeners that might be experiencing this conversation in the future. And so I'm quite wary of things like NFTs, not because I'm wary of the underlying technology. I'm in general pretty skeptical of the arguments that technology has a certain teleology to it, and therefore we should be, we should avoid the development of certain types of technologies at all. Like we discussed earlier, I think that NFTs as a technological construct can have some pretty positive uses, some uses that I would like to see them put to. But I'm far more interested in the sort of broader social forces which have caused this technology to be primarily put to use in order to give the idle rich places to spend their money, in order to gain social status over other members of that particular socioeconomic class. And so I think that hasn't really, that's more what I'm interested in talking about. And I want to talk about this in combination. So what was being spoken of right before you sort of called me back into the conversation, I was thinking of Baudrillard here, right? I was thinking of the progression of simulacrum levels according to Baudrillard's work, Simulacra and Simulation. And so a lot of what was being spoken of reminded me of the sort of fourth level of simulacrum as Baudrillard describes it, the one after the order of sorcery, where in effect, the cultural products don't even need to pretend to be real. And oh, doesn't that remind you a lot of the Bored Ape Yacht Club or something like this? It doesn't even need to pretend to be real. And Baudrillard talks about how this is because the experiences of the lives of people are in essence so artificial and so insulated from the ground of life and of being that everything is expected to be artificial. And this, of course, dovetails quite nicely with what you guys were speaking of immediately prior regarding the sort of authentication of utterances and, just living in this sort of crazy theater, this Phil Dickian environment where nothing is real, nothing can be trusted. Well, my natural inclination to this is to basically say, forget NFTs, forget currency. I'm going to focus on the sort of things that are real to myself as a human animal, like animals, other animals, like plants, like the cultivation of food and the act of sitting in meditation, these sorts of things that really get you in touch with what it is to be an embodied creature. And so, I do have a bit of an allergy to all of the NFT discussions that are sort of happening in my corner of the noosphere, because I feel like they are sucking a lot of the air out of the room from the conversation surrounding embodiment and our existence as creatures on a planet with limited resources, where we need to figure out how to hold things in common. And I'm thinking of the conversation I had with Bonita and Forrest over on the Stoa about the deep connection between the notion of the commons and the notion of the sacred to kind of land us back in the sacred. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, I think that's very important, Evan. It's crucial, I think, to tie things back to that. And it's certainly, well, in part, I think that's the reason really for the framing at the beginning, which is seeking to presence these notions. I think that I notice in myself, actually, I'm struggling to articulate the patterns that I'm feeling are there for me to articulate in this. There is something here, and it's come out in other contexts, and I think it can come out in this one. I'm feeling a pressure to do so that's not coming from the three of you. I mean, there's a pressure to run this gauntlet a little bit, because it feels like we're running a bit of a gauntlet in society in general. And as much as the return to the here and now in the sense of embodiment and real relationships with those around you and the field that one is in, it's such an incredibly, it can feel like a very large, impossible to bridge gap between that and an angle of understanding that's presencing such systemic risks and the power of technology and the immensity of all of that. And so how to present some of that dynamic without losing where we are is really crucial. And I'm feeling that the reason why NFTs which is really for me just a kind of like a placeholder for the affordances of Web3, something like that. Why that's so important is because it seems as though these opportunities, there are these moments in technological possibility space that crop up, and how we interact with those initially is going to have some important causal influence on the affordances to come next. And yes, okay, so that's one part. Another part is that there's something of, in the context of such a difficult conversation, and John's often quoting, I believe, Timothy Morton in presencing the notion of hyperobjects quite a lot in his conversations, and I've certainly taken to doing so, or at least finding importance in that notion, which in my comprehension speaks to, whether phenomena in reality of such complexity that we can approach it from many angles, and we might find handholds onto, but in the majority, we require a kind of distributed dialogic process to maintain a sense of. It's often why long conversations are helpful, or long periods of education and contemplation to get a sense of the dynamics that we're swimming in is important. I'm reminded of watching Joe Rogan speak to Daniel Schmachtenberger and Tristan Harris the other day, and Joe himself was undergoing a process of, he was actually searching for that exact word. How do I stay with this? It's like, well, what do we do about all of that? People are just going to forget about it. They're just going to go back to doing what they're doing. I can't hold on to it. It's like, whoa. And it's kind of like that. And so what to do in response to that? Well, part of what I'd put forward, and it would be that something like, and I suppose this has been spoken about a lot. These words are coming to me now. There's probably better ways to put this, but something like, it seems important to enable a dynamic or an attractor, some space, some way of being with each other in a coordinated place in time that is attractive to participate in and to be in, but where that attraction is essentially developed on the basis of a kind of authenticity of interaction and a deep ethical integrity. And so the question is, can there be something like can the perturbations of the technosphere and the attention that's careening this way and that towards the next shiniest thing, which might not actually be that novel, as Anderson's even pointing out, might just be a repetition of previous things, and there's archetypes everywhere. But can we bridge, invite, influence, energy of attention so as to neutrify a distributed, embodied protocol of engagement that births deeply worthwhile artifacts and opportunities for education and contribution and belonging to an increasing number of people without sacrificing the coherence necessary in order for the integrity of that ethical interaction to hold, such that coordinations of genuinely wiser response to the real patterns of the world at a systemic level can be appropriately addressed in people's lives. Something like that needs to be better said. But you see, I'm trying to link back up the embodied with the bigger picture.
The answer is yes. Let's just assume it. Otherwise, what do we do? What are we groping for? What are we reaching for? Anderson, I saw you wanted to.
Well, I was just going to say it's interesting. So, a lot of the, the specifically kind of economic stuff that you were pointing towards, Evan, is sort of what I was, gesturing at quickly and broadly when I was thinking about sort of layers of abstraction and the disconnection from life, right? And so, post Bretton Woods too, we can argue all day about whether or not gold was a good thing to tie anything to either or not. But the point was, right, like we've had these increasing layers of abstraction upon abstraction upon abstraction until what we've got is this like glass onion of purely notional values that's so radically disconnected from the world that that it seems like people's valuation, right, is completely screwed, right, in a way that, it was probably always a bit off kilter, but, all the more so. So, to reference sort of the upper levels of Baudrillard, it's true. We've got this through the looking glass kind of quality. And, at some level, the Bored Ape Yacht Club is perhaps an even more egregious instance of conspicuous consumption than, a $1 million Mickey Mantle baseball card. Both, of course, are the bizarre form of artificial scarcity with no particularly can't really eat either. And, but it does seem as though these things sort of move away from the good. So in the broad good, in the sense of the commons, right? The collective good. When I contemplate that kind of end of things, I find myself very much torn. I mean, I do have kind of a bit of a neo-Luddite streak. I'm very selective in my adoption of technologies, always have been. So there are some things I like to be very front of the line on, and some things I adopt it very, very slowly. And there have been a bunch of digital technologies that I've adopted slowly. I mean, I've only had my first mobile phone for fewer than 10 years because I was unconvinced of the effects of it. And I still stay away from most forms of social media because I am unconvinced about what the weighing it out in terms of what it offers me and what it's doing for other people and so on and so forth. So that kind of desire to throw my clogs into the gears of the machine sometimes, or I guess to borrow Tyler's term, to pick up a hammer, wonder what to do about it and decide I should put it through the front of my monitor, does seize me sometimes. And when we're talking about this kind of thing with NFTs, part of me is like, no, exactly that. We should reground things back into some fundamentals. Like, I don't know if I want to roll things back to absolute biological basics. I would still like to be able to like read Goethe and have a bit of electric light and maybe a radio. But the point is, like pulling things down to these fundamentals of what it means to be alive, what it means to be embodied, what it means to have that consciousness and subjective perspective and the interplay of that with the world is obviously the root of value. Obviously, right? But people don't want to go near it. And the flip side of that is always asking this other question. And the question is like, well, okay, but what can we do with it if it's around? And so then it's a little like, if you'll allow me a crude analogy, it's a little like asking the question, is harnessing this technology, this sort of technology and cultural movement in some way, more like erecting a solar panel or putting up a water wheel that's powered by lemmings rushing off a cliff? And I'm not totally sure which of those it is, right? One of them is like, okay, well, if it's ambient and it's around and people are doing it anyway, can we use this to power something that might actually halfway be useful? And that's the solar panel. And I don't think that most of the versions of it, as I sort of pointed out, that currently exist, do not strike me as being particularly good, but I see potential in them, and maybe potential to do things like, as you mentioned, right, grounded in the real world, or things that allow us to, say, conduct a decentralized right form of exchange that cuts things like central banks out of the loop or something, right? But then part of me sometimes wonders to what extent this is one more instance of a kind of artificially produced form of novelty that's a kind of gold chain loop through the pleasure centers. And therefore that, the onrush of this is something that at best, right, I'm going to use to turn a water wheel as people go over a cliff with it. I don't know. That sounds very dire, and it's not going to make me any fans in the tech sector. But anyway, I'm not sure where I'm going with that, except to say that a lot of what you said, Evan, is quite poignant, is resonant for me. I feel similarly, although Yeah. I'm always sort of weighing this question. It's like, okay, should we be pulling things down, or is there something here? Like, can we do something with this? I did my decade of sort of rejecting the trappings of the modern world, and I eventually left the cave for a handful of reasons. And I still wonder to what extent that was a Faustian bargain. But, there definitely is some power in being able to tap the existing structures to sort of subvert those structures or something. So I wonder if this is one of those cases, I guess. But anyway, sorry, I'm just talking now.
No, I think these are all really great points, and the ones that need to be continually, prevailingly raised. And I would say the answer to your question is yes, the inclusive or. It's going to be both. That's just my sense of it. If we're collectively kind of ascending Maslow's hierarchy towards self-realization, where less and less of our time is being spent on the purely biological maintenance of function, and we have all this abundant resource in the West, we have decisions about what to do with it. And Evan's point about how our monetary value acting as a signal being tightly coupled to what is actually present and what is capable of being done with that. There are financial instruments that have regulated that, for instance. So fractional reserve banking and the manner in which one loans money to what would become a novel experimental process of the creation of some new company or some new idea was gated by this process of the institution itself, the banking institution, collectively deciding whether or not the return on that is going to be a real investment. Because they're looking at the marketplace and they're saying, well, is your idea good enough for us to give you the chance to produce novelty and incur this kind of debt so that we can recover actual value? And in the ever increasing pace of novelty, where we actually have fewer and fewer gated processes, where we're in such abundance that everything is going to be tried, what is in fact the process by which one signals value or finds how to associate it? And I think what happens is once you lose that signal in the wider space, in the marketplace, when you can no longer trust external sources, you collapse back to the self. You collapse back to your own interior space to recognize whatever's there. And so in that sense, what we're developing is a complex network of individuals who are trusting solely within themselves to recognize whatever it is they can extend it out into that space. So I'm listening to you three talk and I'm thinking, okay, these guys are saying things that are matching things that I'm thinking too. And that is giving me a sense of both kind of a confirmation bias, right? But also the recognition of a potential networking effect that may be a type of grounding phenomenon, right? Because in some sense, our bodies, our physical bodies, the record that they represent is the accrual of that continual search for novelty, right? And that what we sit on top of as conscious beings is that record of all that which was successful up to this point, and unsuccessful in lots of different ways. But the physical forms themselves are that deep tissue record of continually searching for what is a set of patterns which can persist in perpetuity. And I think that if we just presence that aspect of needing the wisdom of maintaining contact with each other as the fundamental forces by which we search the novelty space, rather than getting lost in the abstractions. You look on the back of the dollar bill, it's the perfect image, right? It's Maslow's hierarchy, but the I itself is separated and floating, distinct, abstract from that embodied process, right? There's something really interesting there in that symbolism. The ability for us and our observations to separate itself from what has been the record of the past. You used this word earlier on, the concrescence, and I really love this word because what it sits at is this middle point between, in all complex systems, both the pre-operational and the post-operational sense. So you have nascence and you have senescence. And I think you can't really escape these categories. And any system which careening towards novelty, which fundamentally excludes both the developing component that will ultimately become the peace that inhabits that space, and also the decay products, right? The thing that comes out the other side of that machine. When you lose contact with those two distinct spaces, or the three total, that's when you start to see really significant damage being done to the whole web of interaction. And that's where I hope, I think, to try to bring together, by virtue of influence, by real influence on each other, the total number of perspectives that we can reliably introduce to the conversation that gives us that kind of perspectival certainty, right? That we're not just looking at abstractions in the propositional realm, but that there's really a fuller sense of all the different ways of knowing about how it is we can sustain and build these living tissues embedded in all these abstractions. And so, yeah, that's it. I feel like the best we can do is just talk to each other as best we can. And there will be components, broadly speaking, which have no sense of wisdom in the construction of these tools. But as they are endlessly multiplied and heaped onto the table before us as a kind of massive banquet, there will be a significantly representative part of the population which can collectively decide which of those tools to grab hold of, and then how to use them moving forward. And that's the best I can do right now, right?
If I can quote and then paraphrase William Gibson, the street finds its own uses, but so does the Sangha.
Yes.
So I think we got to be careful, though, about the uses that the street finds or that the Sangha finds. I think back to the phrase, the medium is the message, right? When we think about the sort of medium that, not just NFTs, Web 3.0, hell, Web 2.0, 1.0, our mutual friend, Forrest Landry, points out the inherently toxic nature of technology as currently constituted, right? In that we do not currently know, as a species or as individuals, how to create this level of technology in such a way that it can participate in a closed cycle of resource recycling in the manner that life does. So when I die, fungi will eat me, I will turn into dirt, trees will grow out of what I used to be, my water will be recycled into the atmosphere, and other life can continue, right? But when we create computer chips with, a massively globified economy with, the extreme EUV technology and all of the tailings that come from mining the heavy metals that are required and all of the damage done to the environment there. Well, we don't really know how to plug that back into the environment in a way that's supportive of really any kind of life, right? And furthermore, it's not just this aspect of it, but when you think about the current moment, someone else you guys might know, Yosha Bach, has made the point a few times that we essentially have burned, several 100 million years worth of trees. That's what fossil fuels essentially are, several 100 million years worth of organic matter from mainly plants, right? And we kind of only have really one shot at that level of accessible negentropy that we can then turn into useful work, right? And so the question that occurs to me is, well, how much of that energetic allocation that, as far as we can tell as a species, is sort of a one-shot thing, how much of that are we spending on things like Amazon Alexa and NFT apes and other sort of just kind of crazy shit, to be honest, right? Suburbs are another great example, but at least suburbs have some connection to like humans wanting a sense of physical safety, raising a family, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I guess where I'm going with this is I'm actually not as optimistic as like, yes, there will be a way. No, I think that choice is a thing that exists, and we have the ability to make bad choices as well as good ones as individuals and as a species. And so, when I look at the current situation, I think that people are far too focused on the cultivation of novelty and not focused enough on the notion of cyclical recycling of the outputs of our lives, basically. So is the output of what we do the input into some other living process with which we can coexist, or is it just spewing a trail of indigestible inorganic waste all over the planet? It's not clear to me that we're anywhere close to striking the right balance with this, and it's not clear to me that we really get a second chance.
Yeah.
Can I squeeze one observation in real quick? We notice in let's say like the distinction between all of the manners in which mankind destroys the natural environment. We've observed something like a keyhole species or keystones. We have different names for it, but it's where if you change the components in any given environment, they may, based on their inherent programming, completely destabilize something, right? And so they're behaving in a kind of similar way where they're not cognizant of their impact on the environment. The external process is further destabilizing things, but at some point homeostasis is reached via some other process. And I think these other processes represent these continual epicycle additions, right? So there is another predator which eats a prey, or there's another parasite which parasitizes and then limits the population growth of a particular species. And so what we're looking at right now, in a sense, is in that broader sphere, you have these very dominant organisms in the marketplace that are wreaking havoc in total. And what we're looking for is another set of organisms to act as an epicyclic friction or rebalancing mechanisms to reach towards homeostasis. That whatever actions we are engaged in, if we are to be considering those actions good or eusocial or however you want to frame it, if they're to be distinct, it's acting on the real existence of those imbalancing factors by the continual transformation of the products of that activity. And so I don't think you will be able to stop, except with violence, people utilizing something like NFTs to do absolutely, worthless things like the Bored Ape Yacht Club. But if I can somehow, right now in my conversation with you, design some capacity or some conversation that translates that product, the resources, right? So if 1 out of every 10 person who owns a Bored Ape Yacht Club can take the money that they accrued from it, and I can convince them to utilize that in some fundamentally distinct effort, which is going to return us to some embodied sense, then what we're talking about is developing a type of parasitic process, perhaps, but in a useful way. Sorry, children again.
When I alluded earlier and mentioned this idea of like passing through a dark age without getting into this too deeply, I've gone through a series of phases over sort of 25 years in how I look at this stuff. And in, the last maybe 3, 4, I concluded that that the most of the choices that seem like the early choices, can we preserve our way of life? Can we preserve our civilization? The answer is no, definitely not. The question now is like, so, and not even counting whatever the hell, but, microplastics, species extinction, et cetera, just on the greenhouse gas front, right? The question is like 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, 6, 8, at some point it's a planet of jellyfish. So I take it as a given that our civilization in its current configuration is going to collapse. Of course it is. And okay, every civilization collapses sooner or later. That's fine. The question when we think about it, to what extent most of the kind of novelties that we are currently producing sort of make it through the narrow gate Who the hell knows? The Romans had all kinds of interesting stuff that did not make it through the narrow gate. We lost concrete, we lost wine vending machines for quite a while. I still don't have a wine vending machine, so that still may be lost to antiquity. But there were some things that did make it through. So technologically speaking, for instance, obviously the kind of like mass, despoiling that's required for the sorts of like electronic technology that we have. And it's gross and horrific, right? Between plastics, water use, rare earths, et cetera, et cetera. That stuff's all a nightmare, to say nothing of like the human cost of its production. But I often think about it in slightly simpler terms. So the technology that I often settle on in this respect is radio. I don't think radio is going anywhere as long as there are like, if there's more than 100,000 humans on the planet, we're still going to have radio. You can build a radio with very easily, frankly, with, a few relatively simple parts, some strips of metal and a lemon. You can build a radio. Radio isn't going anywhere. Like there's a sense in which, unless we absolutely crater our complexity into the ground and it's a like Cormac McCarthy's The Road style, murdering each other for a can of Coca-Cola in a burning wasteland, and who knows, might be. But otherwise, the likelihood that we're going to preserve some of those technologies, I think, is pretty high. Like we've ratcheted ourselves into a certain kind of place. Now, the hope is, of course, obviously, that those technologies are preserved in a kind of like, distributed, decentralized way that allows us to preserve some notion of community and some, basis of some of the knowledge and wisdom that we've gotten without, without carrying with it all of the despoiling aspects. But in terms of like our complexity dropping down, guaranteed. And probably, it's so hard to say this without seeming callous, but I suspect I'll be a victim of it. So I think it's okay. I think we need to go through that collectively. It would be nice if billions and billions of people didn't die, obviously, because that's going to disproportionately affect parts of the world that are socioeconomically disadvantaged. And in many of those places, it's already hitting them, right? As a WAG recently said, most people's vision of collapse is just living at the same standard of living as the people who pick their coffee. So, I think that it would be good if that isn't going to happen. I don't see any way that that isn't going to happen, the way that things are lined up now. I don't think that our various sort of social collective actions, I don't think that our technologies, I don't think any of those things are going to, at this point, steer us away from, that particular gauntlet. The question is, can we actually extract something from this particular period? Like, did we really come up with everything that was worth doing 3,000 years ago, or did we actually come up with something worth keeping? And when I think about something like radio, I think that's actually maybe worthwhile. You know what I mean? Like that kind of large scale communication tool that's relatively integrated with the environment is maybe actually worthwhile. I don't know if we should keep antibiotics, but I sort of want to keep some version of modern dentistry. That's a preference I have. I don't know.
Yeah, I've heard some conjecture about dentistry even. Can you believe it?
Really?
Well,
what's
just
the conjecture?
Orthodontistry, to be more specific. I don't know much about it, so I raise it more as a joke than anything else. But the idea is that there's something like the way we've been feeding children foods that don't require them to chew as much has led to has violated the integrity of the jaw structure or what have you, which perpetuates the teeth becoming out a certain way, but then braces being put on actually ends up fucking up your capacity to, I don't know the right terms, fucks up your mouth basically. And that a lot of people who actually end up getting braces later on in life have to get complete replacements because there's some process, it's got a name, it's something of the repairing process. It's like you don't allow the teeth to move as much, and so they lose some of their resilience, something like that. Right. Anyway, that's the type of, when I hear that stuff come up on my YouTube feed, I start to sweat because I'm like, I really don't want to pay attention to this because I got a false tooth, I had braces, which actually leads me to the point I'd like to make as we move toward the 2-hour mark here, which is comes back to attachment and how difficult it is to be be creatures that attach to things and lose them. And it reminds me, so Evan, you suggested to me that I read a book by Peter Kingsley called Catafalque about a month and a half ago. And I mentioned to Anderson that I read that book, and I took a break from it for a while, but I finished it the other week. And I found it an impactful book, and I'd like to reach out to Peter Kingsley. I don't know if he's interested to talk, but it seems to me he's quite steadfastly taking a certain perspective, and part of me resists it, part of me respects it, and it's multifaceted. I'm not going to get to it all, but the word catafalque is a somewhat obscure Italian word, as Evan and Anderson will know, and I think I mentioned this to Tyler as well. That means it's something like the wooden base that a coffin is laid on during a funeral ceremony. And so the word was used in part because it came to him in a dream, but also because it's representative of the attitude toward the collapse of culture, which he says is not so much collapsing, but already dead, and that the right relation to it, our right relation to what has become of Western culture, is to treat it as such and to grieve it in some important sense. And it's not a particularly inspiring message at face value. And I'm just noting in myself the challenge that is made when we really breathe through the reality of the toxicity that that we've been everything that we've been raised in, that we're not just that, there's of course the other side, and there's value to be found in the muck and all of that, but it's not a particularly inspiring message if I just have the feeling of tending to a coffin. Like, what comes after it's buried? What comes afterwards? Who will be there for my coffin? Is it just we don't have anyone there for us? Are we giving up on that process? Are we giving up on some process of, I agree with the move to die well, to practice dying well, something like that. I resonate with that strongly, but that has to be embedded for me in a dedication to what's worth dying for. That there's something worthwhile, say, to affirm in the process, that one doesn't, but it's so challenging because I want to say something like that, one doesn't just leave all the mess for the children, and yet the children's mess is the children's mess, and it's theirs to be in relationship to. And so there's that dynamic of, well, obviously, at some stage, one's watch is over and it's time to go to sleep. And that is what it is. It's not there to fix the world. It's a ridiculous notion. And so we have to accept, again, our inefficacy and our incapacity in relation to all that's around us. And yet, nevertheless, there seems still to be a way of holding that and affirming that process that is for something of a more transcendent, worthwhile. Again, for me, language that I find solace in my own expression is loving transformation. And so when I think of what, our time might be worth remembering for, and there'll be so much it's remembered for that maybe we don't want to have our names pinned to on the placard, and there are others who can make these points better than me, but there seems to be such an opportunity to gather together for, I say something, I don't want to always end up being a bit too grandiose. I don't want to contain myself behind these damn words. But there's something like grieving with a purpose, you know, not just grieving for the sake of grieving. And yet grieving has to be something that is again for itself, because, you know, not to objectify it, not to, you know, the language of extraction is an interesting one, because we have to extract, and we also have to sow back into the soil, as Evan's pointing towards. That's going to happen anyway. And so if we are just to the soil, which we are, then what is the right way to go? It seems to me there's a profound, say, moment, dynamic, to gather with people at all and to be in relation to what is in processes of communication, with some attempt broadly construed towards the good, enabling choice, as Forrest puts it, which is always a helpful expression in flows like these, that there's a way for that is an attractor, and what can come of that, the significance of that, the significance of the earnestness towards that, what that means for the mutual participation in art in some deeply affirmative sense, in some sense that, I don't know, weaves us in together with the inexorable patterns that we're inevitably a part of, and yet at the same time affirms the dignity of our participation in them and our right as life to be and appreciate life, despite all that also implies, and all of the many ills of our ignorance that we are perpetuating. Anyway, I thank you for the opportunity to express some of that. It's there's these conversations, you know, they are for me part of an invitational process for those who are listening, and perhaps motivated again from this point that I think Evan made, but we've all resonated on, which is something like, how can the excesses of our behavior actually afford some nutrition for others, how to actually be part of some nutritive process. And, well, you know, the invitation's open to further conversations here, but that I don't know, there's invitations for those wishing to participate in really all that's been discussed here. Maybe I'll just leave it at that. I'm conscious of the time and knowing that best not keep each other too long. Not sure how you're all feeling about that. Want to open the space for anyone if they have closing reflections, or if they'd like to take it on, if we'd all like to stay.
Can I just say that in the course of speaking there, you twice paused and said, "I don't know." Right? There was twice kind of a break where you're like, "I don't know," in the way in which we're all maybe slightly chastising when our language fails us, right? And I think we have, I mean, you know, that's a very good instance of what Evan was talking about when we're talking about dropping into that moment of aporia, right? That the sort of the profound unknowing. And I think maybe there's something captured there, which is like, you know, of course, at some level, we are all, you know, lost in the labyrinth with very few markers. But there's a big difference at some level between being lost in the labyrinth by oneself and being lost in the labyrinth in company, right? Being able to go with 3 other people in, you know, Wizard of Oz fashion, you know, has a lot to recommend it. even if we don't necessarily know exactly where we came from and we don't know precisely where we're going, right? And we may be variably convinced of each other's navigational skills or how we're collectively making these decisions. There is actually something I think really profound about being in that situation, right? Being in a kind of intersection within the aporia and within the I don't know. And I think that, speaking to, what you have in mind, sort of with this whole project, Tim, that extends past just the four of us. And this has been like an absolutely fascinating conversation. But obviously it also extends to other people that are going to resonate, that are going to connect. People are going to hear this and they're going to resonate and they're going to connect. And they're going to get the distinct sense that maybe they're not at precisely exactly the same intersection in the labyrinth as we are, but they can hear us like one row over. And that matters. I think it really means something. Anyway, so.
Yes, that's right. They can hear me banging my head into the same piece of damn wall again and again. Circling around the sentences.
Yeah, knocking walls and laying breadcrumbs and
right,
sending out bad signals, all these different metaphors.
Yeah. Well, I'm feeling like it might be worthwhile to close this up here. I just want to thank you all again. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Anderson. Each one of you, there's such a story to tell. I often do get the feeling that I'm saying, maybe it would be better if I just, I guess we can never really reveal our whole selves or something like that. But I have a lot of appreciation for you all. And thank you for joining in this emergent process where we, in some sense, leave behind so much of ourselves so as to actually bring fully what we are to what is actually here. And so in that sense, we do get to know each other quite well. I guess this is just a nod to, I guess, some of my unprofessionalism as a podcaster. And just to say to those listening, well, I just said it, that I appreciate you all very much. So thank you for listening. And if you enjoy these podcasts, please consider sharing them or leaving a review, and perhaps also to consider supporting it on patreon.com/voicecraft. It will help sustain the podcast, build the network, and make possible more community events and educational resources.